In order, 601. Stand for the pledge of allegiance, please. Let's put my mask on. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, I need a motion to adopt the agenda.
I'll make a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
Have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay, motion made and seconded, all in favor? Aye. All right, old business, Ginger, you wanna go ahead and start?
Yes, so, basically,
Can you guys hear Ginger?
they're okay, they've heard me talk a lot. We'll be okay. So basically what we're trying to do tonight is to give some good explanations about and a description of what the downtown planning project is all about for the town council, and have an opportunity to discuss and give you information about what the tax incremental financing feasibility study is all about. So I think that, I can't tell, there they are, I see you guys on the computer. So they have a PowerPoint presentation to present to you tonight, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. And I know that you have a hard copy of the PowerPoint also. And just to briefly remind you all how we got to where we are right now, 2 years ago, in October of 2019, LCP hosted a visioning process with the help of the Oregon Main Street program. And what came out of that was around 7 goals or activities that could, 7 goals with activities or suggestions of activities that could help our downtown. And in the last 2 years, of course, we got really slowed down with COVID. And we were also looking for funding to go forward with the planning process. So we finally achieved getting a really good idea of where we wanted to start. And then we had to find the funding to go forward to be able to work with Nick and Alyssa. So we accomplished that. So now we're actually boots on the ground and moving forward with processes that are going to give us a lot of good information that we can use to go forward with our partners, which are the chamber and the town and LCP. So that's sort of the introduction. I'm going to let Alyssa and Nick introduce themselves because they do a good job of that, and they can take it from here.
Great. Good evening, everyone, Mayor and council members. My name is Alyssa Pishka. I'm with Bridge Economic Development. And as Ginger indicated, we've been working together for a few years and coming up with a strategy on how to focus on a downtown plan. So we'll touch on that, but the focus of tonight's presentation, and Nick's going to lead us through that, and I'll let him introduce himself, is on tax increment financing. And that is a tool that would help implement the plan. So the plan needs to happen regardless anyway. We can find other resources to implement projects through the state, perhaps, nonprofits or so forth. But TIF, tax increment financing, is one tool. So we really just wanted to talk about that tonight and go through that since it's a pretty involved topic. So I'll hand it over to Nick now.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, Mayor and councilors, for having us tonight. So we've popped up with Tiberius Solutions. We're a public finance firm that helps cities all across the region look at unusual finance issues. One of the things that we specialize in most is tax increment financing, and that is the use of Oregon control. And it is capturing tax revenue generated in an area and reinvesting it back into that area. So for tonight, we're going to describe sort of how that tool works, get into the nuts and bolts of it. Then talk a little bit more about the particular feasibility study we're doing in the town of Lakeview, including going over a potential boundary for where this tool might be used for your downtown, and then talking about types of projects that could be funded for use of financing in your downtown. For this presentation, Alyssa and I will be swapping back and forth between some slides. Alyssa, you want to run the PowerPoint, or should I? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have it, can you all see it? I have it pulled up.
Yeah, we can see it, and they have hard copies as well.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead and lead me through it, yeah, I can still go through it, yeah.
Alright, for some reason, it's not sure, oh, here it is, we've got it. Perfect. So, to start with, on how tax increment financing works in the next slide, yeah. It's, the one thing we want to get across at the very outset of these projects is that tax increment financing is division of property tax revenues. So it is not a new tax that people within the town of Lakeview have to pay. It's not increasing anyone's tax bill, but there's also no such thing as free money. So this funding has to come from somewhere, and where it comes from is foregone tax revenue that would otherwise have gone to the overlapping taxing districts. So the town itself, the county, the other taxing districts that are present in the area. So it's a division of those tax dollars. It has a number of limitations, and perhaps the most important is a term called maximum indebtedness. That's a wonky term, we only use it because that's what the legislature decided to call it in statute when they created this program decades ago. But that maximum indebtedness term really means the total amount of projects that you can fund in an area. So every tax increment finance plan, as it's created, gets that spending limit, let's say $10 million. And you're allowed to continue collecting taxes in the area until you have paid for $10 million worth of projects. And at that point in time, you have to cease collecting those tax dollars, close down the area. Hopefully the investments that you've made have really transformed the area and boosted tax revenue, that all the taxing districts who were foregoing their revenues temporarily now reap the benefits of a higher tax base. Another limitation that we see often for tax increment finance districts is a duration provision. These are not required for tax increment finance plans, you don't have to have one. You can continue to let a tax increment finance plan exist for as long as is necessary in order to pay off that maximum indebtedness. A lot of communities do choose to impose a duration provision, just to make sure that these plans will linger forever. So typically we'll see that duration provision sometime between 20 and 30 years. Just as a side note there, you hear about a 20 to 30 year duration provision. It's important to know that tax increment financing is not usually thought of it as a quick fix. This is a long-term investment. When you first create the area, you're going to have relatively humble revenues generated there. And over time, as new investment takes place in the area, that's what's generating the tax revenue. And so it builds and builds towards the end. And so 10, 20 years from now is when you start to see a real significant cash flow. So this is a really long-term tool for how you plan and fund projects over time. Another important limitation is that the funding from tax increment financing can only be used to pay for capital projects. This isn't something where you can hire an extra police officer and pay for their salary, or you can pay for park maintenance, or to go out and sweep the streets. All of this has to be real capital projects. You can build infrastructure, putting in new roads and sidewalks, undergrounding utilities. You can have private sector companies, businesses, spruce up their storefronts, do seismic upgrades. We'll talk more at the end of the presentation about the specific examples, but it's important to keep in mind that this tool can only be used for capital projects. And one other limitation I wanted to point out here is that by statute, the area has to be divided. That term means something in common English, but in the statute, it's actually a tortured and twisted term that has 100 different sub-definitions within it. The point is though that almost any area across the state certainly meets this statutory definition of private. And I think when we're looking at downtown Lakeview, we're looking at the types of infrastructure needs that are there and how the businesses could best be supported by this tool, it would certainly meet that definition. A lot more so than some of the other communities that have used it, affluent Portland suburbs and the like. So that's the nuts and bolts. This next chart that's on the screen now illustrates how this tax increment financing works over time. Once you establish the area, the county assessor will look at how much tax is currently being paid on properties in that area, and they'll refer to that as the frozen base. And for all future years, those taxing districts will continue to receive the same amount of tax revenue from the frozen base. But in future years, as the taxes in this area increase, as property values increase, especially from new construction taking place in the area, those taxes become increments. And the increment, instead of going into the taxing districts, is funneled into the urban renewal area or the tax increment finance district. We tend to use those two terms interchangeably. The tool itself is tax increment financing. In Oregon, the statutes refer to this umbrella term of urban renewal. But in a lot of contexts, it doesn't really make sense to refer to urban renewal. We're working in smaller communities across the state, or even in greenfield developments where nothing has been built yet. There's one little piece of this chart that is orange that's showing shared revenue. And that indicates that as your increment grows over time, you actually have the option to share some of that back with the affected taxing districts early, if that's something that the community wants to do. Say, we've been successful in this area, we've been able to pay for the projects that we wanted to fund. Yes, we still have a few more years to go to pay up our debt, but let's start sharing some of our success with other taxing districts sooner rather than later. There are also some statutory requirements that for areas that are really successful, it's no longer a choice about whether or not to share that funding, but it is mandatory. If you hit certain thresholds, you're required to start sharing that funding back with those affected taxes. And then once you reach either your maximum indebtedness, or if you chose to include a provision provision, whenever you reach that limit, the end of the lifespan of the tax increment district, that's when the area closes down, and you can see the blue bar jump dramatically, and all of those taxing districts that were temporarily giving up funding now reap the rewards of the district. So when looking at this chart, the biggest thing that I think is most important is that if you want to set up a successful tax increment finance district, you really want to look at ways that you can invest in projects that shift the trajectory upward, where you're generating more tax revenue when this district ends, that really does benefit everyone and make it worth the trade-off of foregoing revenue during time when the district is alive. Yeah, so this is on the next slide. So how tax increment financing works, this is talking about the process for how you would establish a tax increment finance district. And the acronym there you see on the screen is TIF district. It's something that we commonly say just to save ourselves a tongue twister of getting through tax increment financing. So an important point I want to bring up is that TIF districts can only be established by the town itself. This isn't something where a group of property owners become a veteran do it, or any other sort of nonprofit organization. The town is going to be the entity that forms a TIF district. And in doing so, it's commonplace for the town to put together an advisory committee made up of stakeholders, including those taxing districts that are impacted, as well as maybe property owners, developers, and key neighborhood groups that are involved in the process, and make sure that they really take ownership of the boundary, the projects, duration, and all of the details that are going to go into a TIF district plan. Along with that, it's also recommended to do public outreach and make sure that all members of the community have a chance to hear about this tool, understand the plan for how the town will use the tool, and are on board with the vision for what projects and what area this tool would be useful. Once you have an advisory committee in place and going forward with the district, the key things to do are inform the boundary of the area. We're going to show a boundary later tonight that we're using for this feasibility study. It's not set in stone. And if you actually decide to move forward, you're going to maybe play around with that boundary and make sure you approve all the property that's inside and outside of it. You'll also then need to identify all the specific projects that would be funded with TIF. And again, tonight we'll talk about some examples of what could be funded, but ultimately there needs to be an official list of all the projects that you're going to fund in this area. And if it's not a project listed in the plan, then it's not a project that can receive funding from the TIF district. And then you'll also at this point in time be agreeing on the expectations for the length of the plan, that duration provision if you choose to put one in, and the maximum indebtedness, the total amount of projects that you can fund in the area. During this process, you're also required, whether or not you include them on an advisory committee, you are required to do outreach to the affected taxing districts, to share the information about the plan, to make sure they understand the amount of money that they would be foregoing. I mean, to give them an opportunity to comment. The town actually has the unilateral authority to adopt a TIF district without getting approval from the other impacted taxing districts, but you do have to consult with them and provide them with all the information, keep them abreast of what you're doing in this situation. The process for actually establishing the district is spelled out in statute, and it requires a pretty lengthy public process. There's multiple meetings, public hearings for that approval. That includes establishing an urban renewal agency first. That agency is often made up of the same members as the town council itself, but you do have the option of establishing an agency board that looks different from your town council. Some communities have done that. And that urban renewal agency would then first have a meeting on the plan where they recommend they go forward. It then goes to planning commission. The planning commission has a hearing to make sure the plan conforms with the comprehensive plan of the community. And then it comes to the town council for another public hearing to approve the adoption of the plan. So lots of opportunities are built into the process for the public to be able to hear, learn about, and comment on the use of tax value. And with that, we're going to start talking about the boundary here. And I did want to call out a couple of key limitations on the boundary. Within any community, the amount of property inside of TIF district cannot exceed 25% of that town's assessed value or that town's acreage. And that's something worth keeping in mind. At the moment, the town is considering not just this downtown potential TIF district, but also potentially using this tool for residential property as well. And when we've looked at the draft boundaries for both of these areas, they are too large in terms of the total amount of assessed value to comply with the limit right now. That means moving forward, if the town were to want to do both of these, there need to be some changes. The exact changes we're not trying to dwell on at this point in the feasibility study. It's going to depend on whether there are annexations that happen to the town that changes the total amount of acreage and assessed value that you have to work with. But we have identified a handful of properties that are inside of this downtown boundary that make easy candidates for removal if they need to be in the future. And by easy candidates, what I mean are the relatively small properties with a lot of value that probably aren't going to need to take advantage of any of the programs and investments that the TIF district would provide because they've either recently redeveloped or they're the type of property that's just unlikely to redevelop in the future. So with that, I think our next slide starts to show the boundary. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to talk about how we came up with the boundary that's shown here.
Great, thanks, Nick. Before we go into the more tangible boundary, are there any questions on the process that you may have for Nick? Any questions? Okay, I will proceed. As Nick mentioned, this is our initial draft to start structuring conversations and take this concept of TIF and start putting it on the ground to make it a little bit more tangible. And so, good advice from Nick start big, because it's always easier to decrease. And so as he said, this is likely to have to decrease, so this is clearly a draft. So we want to preface that as we go through this. But what we wanted to do is explain how did we come up with this boundary. So the first thing we did was really look at the existing zoning within the town. And what we really wanted to stay with is the commercial districts, which are shown here as the red and the pink, and the industrial districts. Because what we really want to do, in addition to the idea of housing, is this is an economic development tool. How do we help businesses stay and grow in Lakeview? That's really what's driving this from the commercial perspective, is using this as an economic development tool for the downtown. So that was the first thing, was the zoning. The next thing we looked at is what are the property opportunities, as Nick mentioned. And so you can see here these X's. This is Lakeview Lumber that has been sitting vacant. This is another industrial building that's up for sale. The Napa Auto Parts building, as you can see, would generally can meet that term of blight, similar with that apartment structure. So you can see here we were finding just quick examples of properties that could be improved if this TIF program went further. And when you see here this dark black line, what we're talking about is storefronts. So that's one of the elements you can implement with TIF, and we'll show you some examples of storefront improvements. So first we thought about, what are the properties, what are the buildings that could benefit from this program? That's what started kind of defining the boundaries. Then what we considered is, you're undergoing a transportation system plan right now. So we worked with Kittleson to see where do they say the town needs to be investing in the infrastructure. Because in our opinion, the best thing you can do with your TIF dollars is invest in public infrastructure. That's one of the best things you can do, because that will help bring private investment, and you're investing in a public good. So that's what we looked at with the TSP. And when you put them together, you can see how the boundary starts coming together. Here are these major corridors that highlighted in blue. The TSP is highlighting need sidewalks. They need paving improvements, really more from the sidewalk perspective, really helping people become more mobile. Senior citizens wheel about. And then this is the intersection that has been proposed for improvements. So that's really, those core elements is what gives the bones, and then the zone pretty much outlines the boundary, the proposed boundary. So I'll turn back over to you now. And look, are there any questions on that before we kind of go? Now we can move into projects, but I'll see if there's any questions on that.
I have none at the moment.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't have any right now. I probably will have a lot later.
Okay, we're here for you. All right, so I'll hand it back over to you, Nick.
Sure, so these next couple of slides talk about the types of projects and powers that an urban renewal or tax and finance district has. And I've got two slides on this because the first is very broad powers. So the statutes essentially say that any power related to new construction, real estate transaction, and public-private partnerships, that's what's meant by the PPs there. Anything related to new construction, real estate transactions, and public-private partnership, as long as those powers are intended to achieve housing or community redevelopment outcomes, are allowed for an urban renewal agency. But when it comes to those broad powers under this statute, the specific activity that we want to undertake must be specifically delegated by the town council. So you do have broad latitude. The more specific powers in the next slide typically cover the bulk of the activities that any tax and finance district wants to do. So these specific projects are listed in statute. These don't require town council to delegate the authority to the urban renewal agency. They are inherently eligible activities for an agency to undertake. And so these projects, as a first caveat, they must be located inside of the TIF district. So you can't use the money that you generate in downtown to pay for infrastructure outside of that boundary. But beyond that, the types of projects that are eligible include rehabilitation or conservation of existing buildings, acquire real property, demolish buildings on those properties, construct streets and other utilities, repair and rehabilitate existing buildings, relocation assistance. So if you are going to acquire property, demolish it, or you need to remodel it, and there's tenants that need to be relocated, you're allowed to pay some funds to help relocate that. Sale of land and buildings. So once you've acquired property, you can then sell it potentially at a profit and use those funds to continue investing in the area. And then to pay for neighborhood or community development plans. Let's say you do need to update a stormwater master plan for the area or something like that. And it's related to the economic development activity in the area. That's another allowed use. So those are the categories of projects that are specifically called out in statute, in addition to the more broad powers listed before, where anything related to construction and real estate, as long as it's going to help with economic redevelopment. And so with that, Alyssa, I'm going to turn it back to you to show some of the examples of what you're considering might be good uses of the tool for Lakeview.
Great. So the first example we want to highlight, this is a fairly common tool in a lot of communities. It's called the Storefront Improvement Program. And this is Vancouver, Washington. And you can see here, the reason why storefront improvements are really popular is because it's working with existing buildings. And it can range in cost, and typically what the TIF district does is match a grant for up to $25,000 or $50,000 is usually what we hear. But the nice thing is, it's not a significant investment that can make a real impact on the community. As you can see here, by just opening up these windows, removing the paint, coming up with a new paint scheme, you're really, changing the awnings, you can have a big impact with not a lot of investment. And yet these improvements are what start to increase the property value in the community. And back to that chart that Nick was showing, you start increasing those private investments, which is the goal. Just as important, if not more important, this becomes a vibrant place for your community. People want to go into these businesses, restaurants will come into these areas. You can start bringing tourists, even more tourists gathering in these areas. So it's really a twofold focus. Another project we can really look at and we talked about is the streets. So this is the current snapshot of Center Street compared to North F Street. So if one of the goals for downtown is to increase pedestrian activity, improve outdoor seating, making it more vibrant, having a gravel sidewalk along Center Street is probably not what you want to have to achieve that goal.
Hold on a minute. Hold on a minute.
Yeah.
This piece that you're talking, this gravel right there, that's because there was a water leak there. The town had to tear that up and fix the water leak. So that hasn't been put back together yet. So that's why that's
Yeah, and even with the scoring of the sidewalk and the conditions of the sidewalk, so we would, compared to what F Street looks like, it's just a very, and then the light poles and the trees and the bump outs, they're very different feeling corridors. So that's why in thinking about a downtown improvement plan, improving the sidewalk is also going to allow you to make it a more vibrant community. And I hear you that that gravel won't be permanent, but the overall condition isn't as strong as it could be. Another use of TIF is this is what they did in Klamath Falls with a similar type building. So on the upper stories of their historic buildings, they converted them to apartments, brought them up to code, and again, bringing people downtown, alternative housing. Housing is a key issue for Lakeview, we know, as many communities across Oregon. So this is another example of what can be done with that public-private partnership to incentivize a developer to take this on. Because this is more significant than obviously a storefront improvement. This is a much more significant improvement. And then finally, you could be looking at, this is the Lakeview lumber site. So one of the elements you could be applying TIF is helping to pay for these public streets and the stormwater, the sewer, the water, to help offset those costs, which are a public good. The public will be using these to incentivize private development. So that's another example within this boundary specifically of how TIF could be applied. And then, so any questions on types of projects that we just presented there?
No.
Okay, so the last slide we just wanted to share with you again, I know that why are there two boundaries, why are there two discussions? So this is a more narrow focused boundary that we'll be working with LCP on regarding the downtown plan. And so we've narrowed this down to just that pink and red commercial district element. Because much of the downtown plan, through that grant from SCOED, is recognizing the impacts of COVID. And it seems like a long time ago, it seems like the impact started a long time ago, but it was only 18 months ago. But these retailers were most hit when COVID hit. So originally, we really started wanting to think about how do we bring back the restaurants, the retail, help them become more vibrant again. So that was the genesis of the downtown plan. And as we mentioned, we want to go through this with the community to say, what are the priorities? Is it storefront improvement program? Is it more housing? Is it streets? So what do you want to see in your downtown core? That's really what we're getting out of the downtown plan. And then document that. What are the programs and the projects that you want to see? Because once it's documented and there's rationale behind those projects and why they're needed for economic development, then LCP and the town and the chamber can go secure grant funding. It's very, very, very hard to get grant funding if you don't have a plan and a rationale for why projects are needed. So that's the real crux of the need for this downtown plan, is to gather that public input, make this a community plan of priorities, and then allow your stakeholders to get the grants necessary to implement the projects. And then we just want to emphasize again that TIF, if it goes forward, would be one tool to help. The downtown plan is going to go forward and it can be implemented with other tools if necessary, but TIF would be one that we want to be exploring for the community. And that summarizes our presentation.
So is Shannon on at all? Is she on? Okay.
Still on there, Shannon?
Yep, I'm still here.
Okay.
So now is the time for you guys to ask questions. And I'm sure you'll have others as time goes on and you think about it. So I'm gonna be here, we're accessible later on, but you've got time tonight to talk about it and ask questions.
Well, the downtown plan, I like that. But what I'm looking at is I'd like to see this area done before anything else is done. If you've been talking about East Street for years and nothing's been done. And what's gonna happen is if when that roof caves in, it's the roundup, it's gonna take the wall, two walls with it, and one of them is the bike shop, the other is the photo shop. I've already talked to the building inspector, I was in there with him one day when it pouring down rain. And we got just as wet, we've been better off standing outside. And what's gonna happen is when that roof caves in, it's gonna bring the sides with it. That needs to be one of the number one priorities if you're gonna do anything with it or tear it down.
So, yeah, I totally, I've been living this too, right along with everybody else, so I
This area
completely
here
understand.
should be the number one priority.
Right, but in order to get to that point, it's the point that Alyssa was making is that we have to have input from the building owners, from the folks that are doing business downtown that are both business owners and building owners, et cetera, so that we can document this, so that we can go and help with resources, with funding to do these things. So if there will be, I'm sure, a priority. If that's one of the priorities that everybody feels is at the top of the list, then that's one of the things that would be looked at first, I would imagine. But what we're doing is collecting the information, putting it together, and then developing some sort of a list, a plan, whatever you want to call it, and then where do we go from there to find the resources to do these things?
So are you talking about getting all that together before we do all this other, tax increment financing? The
So
things that we have to do to accomplish that?
The
It
tax,
seems like it would take quite a while.
it does take time. The TIF takes time. I mean, yeah, I absolutely, what we're doing right now with looking at and asking the community engagement meetings, the stakeholder meetings, finding out what people really want to see and what's important to them. And the TIF is, like they were saying, it's a resource tool. Along with other resource tools would be grants, loans, donations, investors, there's all sorts of, you have to kind of think of it as your own personal financial plan for yourself. You've got, you're pretty diversified. Most people, they have retirement funds that are usually investments. You've got savings, you've got your salary. Well, it's the same kind of idea in terms of resources to do things in a downtown area. You've got to have more than just one thing, one resource in order to help pay for it. So the tax increment financing is just a tool. It's a way to do it, and it's a long-term tool. It's not something that's just one and done and here and gone tomorrow. It's something that can be an investment over time. So
Yeah,
this is-
Michelle, if I can chime in here, but
Yes, please.
the long-term timeline on the TIF. This feasibility study that we're working on, we're planning to have finished this fall. That would give the town council enough information to know how much could it fund, what types of projects, what's the time frame in which that fund will be available. If the town wanted to move forward with it, it usually takes 6 to 9 months to go from the direction that yes, let's come up with a plan, let's have that plan adopted. So you'd be looking at sometime next fall perhaps to have the overriding tax increment plan adopted. That timing, how that relates with how the assessor's office implements things, means that it will be the fall of 2024 will be the first year you start to receive revenue. And those revenues do start off relatively small, but nonetheless, there are revenues that will be coming in along that timeline. So you'll be looking at around 2024 for your first dollars coming in. And with those first dollars, then you could start talking to a bank, put together a loan to take care of whatever your highest priority projects are, which could be, for example, renovating a building that's a hazard with a roof that's not structurally sound. So that's the sort of timeline that we're looking at would be if you were interested in moving forward, maybe 2024 for the first year you receive revenues and to begin taking a bite at some of the smaller but high priority projects that you have on your list.
Thank you. Go ahead. Were you gonna say something else? It's not.
Okay. Well, that's all I have for right now.
Yeah, I'd like to look through this a little bit more and see if I have any questions. I'll get to Ginger.
Shannon, do you have anything?
Shannon, you have any questions?
So this is the first step.
I didn't understand.
Could you repeat that, Shannon, please? We didn't hear you.
I said that we need to do whatever we can to revitalize, so I think this is a good first step.
Okay.
So we do have these meetings that are next week. We have one on Tuesday evening that will be downtown building owners, investors, real estate folks, that sort of thing. And we also have the community engagement meeting, which is on Wednesday evening. And I have all that information and so does,
Yes.
I sent them a.
Yeah, we can resend that if it would be helpful. In fact, I think I've got some of the invitations here in my folder. I can just give them to you before I leave. So if you want, I think it would be really helpful for you to be involved in those meetings. They're all gonna be at the annex over next to
Next
the,
Tuesday is council.
pardon?
Next Tuesday is council.
I know, and that is definitely an issue.
Well,
When you guys rescheduled, they rescheduled it during this that we'd already had scheduled, so
Well,
That's
council
our
is
normal
always on the
meeting.
second and fourth Tuesdays of the month.
I'm just telling you.
Well, I'm telling you.
Okay.
Well, that's our normal meeting days. This is second and fourth Tuesday.
I think we could probably figure out how to attend both or to get information over to Ginger as thoughts and feedback. And, and then she'll pass those on to, Alyssa and Nick.
So I have a question. So you had stated that this was done out of grants, that they apply for grants, or the three entities apply for grants, is that correct?
Pardon? Can you ask the question again? I'm trying to understand.
Who applies for the grants?
Who applies for the grants for the project?
Yes.
Uh,
Is that the business owners, is that us as the town, or is that you guys as LCP? Is that the chamber, who applies for these grants?
I think that's really gonna depend on what the projects are. Really, most grants have to go to a public entity or to, like the town or a nonprofit.
Because people are gonna ask if they're responsible for paying for some of this project. Like if I was a business owner, that would be my first question.
Correct.
Am I responsible for the project,
And there
for
will
paying
be,
for a part of it?
right, there will be cases where there will probably be investments on the property owner's part. For instance, there currently is a grant through the Oregon Historic Preservation Office. It's called Diamonds in the Rough.
Right?
And they will finance, or the grant pays up to, it's a reimbursement grant, and it pays up to $20,000 of a project. It's a 50-50. So if you have a $20,000 project for your building, they will give you in a reimbursement form $10,000, and the building owner has to come up with $10,000. So it's kind of, it's a 50-50 deal. That's just one that I know about.
And I would add to that I don't think any of the projects and programs that we're discussing right now would require businesses to pay anything extra. They would all be on a voluntary basis. So if a business owner wanted to participate in one of the programs, they wanted to access grant money that was specific to their property, some of those grants might come with the requirement of matching private funds. But if they were interested in pursuing storefront improvement or any of these other kind of grant programs, nothing's going to force them into participating.
Gotcha.
I don't have anything more unless you guys have something.
I don't have anything.
Okay.
Amy?
No, I don't have any questions right now. I need to think about it.
Shannon, do you have any other questions?
No, I'm good right now.
Okay. Okay, then I guess,
Ta-da!
we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you guys.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.